Alberta's oil warning didn't come as a whisper. It came as a shout across the border, loud, clear, and designed to shake the foundation of North American energy assumptions. When Alberta's premier stated that Canada could redirect 2 million barrels of oil per day to alternative markets, it wasn't just an economic note. It was geopolitical recalibration in real time. Because here's the reality. The US needs Canadian oil, specifically heavy crude, and not just as an option but as a lifeline for entire regions of its refining system.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, and you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
This has never been a partnership of equals, at least not in how the US has treated it. It's long operated under the belief that Canadian supply would always flow south, quietly and dependably, with little leverage from the Canadian side. That belief just collapsed. The US is facing exposure. Its refineries, especially across Ohio, Pennsylvania, and the Midwest, are built around Canadian heavy crude. These facilities were engineered for a specific grade of oil, one that isn't easily swapped for domestic light shale. This isn't a case of turning a dial and rerouting supply. It's structural. It's baked into the operating model of a significant portion of US refining capacity. So when Alberta threatens to send that oil elsewhere, it forces a reckoning. At the heart of this shakeup is Canada's evolving energy strategy, one that no longer centers the United States as its default peer. The country is moving aggressively into the global LNG market. It's not rhetoric, it's infrastructure. LNG Canada Phase 2. Casey listens. Billions of dollars in private investment, government support, regulatory momentum, long-term contracts signed with Asian markets that offer not just growing demand, but more stable long-term pricing and shorter, cheaper shipping routes from Canada's west coast. This is not a pivot on paper. It's a pivot in motion. Canada's LNG expansion reduces its exposure to US demand and strips away one of Washington's quiet leverage tools, trade pressure. Tariffs that once served as economic weapons now carry less weight. You can't strong-arm a supplier that doesn't rely on you. You can't dictate terms when the other party has a dozen new buyers lined up at the dock. And that's the transformation at play. Canada isn't waiting to be included in someone else's plan. It's executing its own. From a policy perspective, the contrast couldn't be sharper. While the US is bogged down in permitting delays, political back-and-forth, and regulatory unpredictability, Canada has created an environment that welcomes investment, streamlined permitting, long-term demand certainty, clear national direction, and investors have noticed. Projects like LNG Canada and Casey Listens are magnets for capital, not because they're speculative, but because they're reliable. That's what investors want, stability. And right now, Canada offers more of it than the United States. That difference is starting to reshape how energy flows, how influence operates, and how countries plan their long-term supply chains. Which brings us back to Alberta's statement. This wasn't some off-the-cuff political soundbite. It was the culmination of a shift that's been building for years. And now, the implications are coming into focus. US refineries, locked into legacy infrastructure, are uniquely vulnerable. They can't absorb a major disruption to Canadian supply without major consequences. If Canada follows through on its threat to redirect oil gradually or decisively, it could trigger price shocks, capacity reductions, and logistical complications for the American Midwest and beyond. The U.S. energy system has never been as insulated as policymakers like to believe. It has always depended on neighbors, infrastructure, and global trade routes. But it's the dependence on Canada, quiet, consistent, taken for granted, that is now showing cracks. And the U.S. doesn't have a quick fix. Switching to domestic light oil isn't a seamless transition. The refining mismatch is too large. Building new capacity or retrofitting old plants takes time and money. And even if those projects started tomorrow, they wouldn't replace the short-term need for Canadian heavy crude. That's what gives Alberta's message its bite. It's not a vague threat. It's a reflection of real-world leverage. And it underscores a bigger point. The North American energy map is changing. It's no longer centered entirely around U.S. demand and control. Canada is carving out its own path, less dependent, more diversified, and globally aligned. It's exporting gas to Asia. It's positioning itself as a solution for Europe's supply instability. And it's doing all of this with infrastructure and policies built for the future.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Your feedback helps shape what we cover next, And you being here keeps the conversation going. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.
That shift fundamentally reduces U.S. leverage. It also forces Washington to face a new question. What happens when a key ally no longer needs you? Because for a long time, U.S. energy diplomacy operated on the assumption that it held the cards. But when your supplier has better offers on the table and the infrastructure to reach them, you become just another beer, just another market, no longer indispensable. And the implications aren't just economic, they're strategic. In a world where energy equals influence, Canada's independence reshapes power dynamics. It weakens the U.S. ability to control negotiations, use trade measures to push policy goals, or assume cooperation on every front. This doesn't mean a collapse in U.S.-Canada energy trade, but it does mean a rebalancing, one where Canada has more say, more freedom, and more global options. The LNG infrastructure under construction today is building more than just pipelines and terminals. It's building resilience. Resilience against U.S. trade volatility. Resilience against domestic underinvestment. Resilience against the assumption that Canada will always wait at the door of the American market. That's what makes this moment so important. It's not just a headline. It's a turning point. Because the truth is, Canada was never just a junior partner in the North American energy story. It was the backbone of U.S. refinery operations. It was the quiet stabilizer in volatile oil markets. And now, it's writing a new chapter on its own terms. With Alberta's bold statement, the rest of North America is being forced to read it. If you follow the shifts, the numbers, the strategy, it all leads here. A future where Canada doesn't wait for permission, and the U.S. can't afford to assume control. A multipolar energy framework where influence flows with infrastructure, not rhetoric. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really happening behind the headlines, give it a like. Share it with someone who still thinks Canada is just America's backup plan. Drop a comment below should the US start treating Canada like a partner instead of a fallback. And don't forget to subscribe for more unfiltered looks at the energy and geopolitical stories that are changing the world in real time. Because the rules of the game have changed, and Alberta just proved it's not playing defense anymore. Canada has stepped out of the background and onto the main stage of global energy, and the timing couldn't be more consequential. For decades, the US treated Canada's oil supply as a given, a dependable neighbor, a quiet supplier, a pipeline away from solving domestic shortfalls. But Alberta's declaration that 2 million barrels of oil per day could be redirected away from the US wasn't a bluff. It was a reset. A loud, unapologetic reminder that Canada isn't locked in, and it's not waiting around. The US now finds itself exposed. Because here's what's been buried under decades of trade talk and policy gloss. The US doesn't just use Canadian heavy crude, it depends on it. Especially in the Midwest. Refineries in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, they're designed specifically for it. Not for light sweet crude from Texas shale. Not for imported blends from overseas. They rely on heavy crude that comes from Canada, through a network of pipelines that Washington has alternately praised, ignored, and obstructed. The irony? The very infrastructure that delivers this critical energy is often treated as a bargaining chip held up in court, challenged on environmental grounds, or delayed for political optics. But the consequences of taking that supply for granted are now front and center. Because Canada's not sitting still. It's looking outward. Alberta's warning came against the backdrop of a larger transformation, Canada's strategic pivot toward global LNG markets. And let's be clear, this isn't a vague ambition. It's already in motion. Link Canada's phase 2 expansion is one of the largest energy infrastructure projects in Canadian history. The KC Lissom's LNG project is attracting billions in capital. New export routes to Asia and Europe are being carved out literally with port infrastructure, shipping contracts, and government coordination. Why? Because the global market is shifting. Demand in Asia is rising. Europe is scrambling to secure stable, non-Russian energy sources, and Canada is answering that call without the need to route everything through the US anymore. That's what changes the power dynamic. That's what turns Alberta's statement from a political jab into a geopolitical shockwave. For the US, this means confronting a reality it hasn't had to face in decades. Its primary energy partner has leverage now, not because it's threatening to walk away, but because it doesn't have to stay. Canada is building alternatives, LNG terminals, global trade agreements, shorter shipping routes, and critically an investment environment that's starting to look a lot more attractive than its southern neighbor. Because while Canada is pushing forward with infrastructure and clarity, the US is locked in policy uncertainty. Tariffs shift with political winds. Permitting timelines are erratic. Long-term energy projects stall in red tape. And investors notice. They're not blind to the fact that Canadian LNG projects are getting funded and built while US infrastructure languishes in legal limbo. The message to global markets is simple. If you want stability, invest in Canada. And that's not just bad news for US energy independence, it's a direct threat to American influence. Because energy equals power. When you control supply chains, when you have dependable exports, when allies rely on your resources, you have political capital. But what happens when those allies build their own supply chains? When they can fuel themselves and sell to others, you lose control, you lose leverage, and you lose the ability to dictate terms. That's what's happening now. Canada is detaching itself from American dependency, not out of resentment but out of necessity. The US made itself a volatile partner. Trade threats, Keystone XL's cancellation, tariff uncertainty, legal delays. Canada learned the hard way. Relying too heavily on the US means putting your economic future in someone else's hands. So now it's hedging, scaling, diversifying. This isn't about nationalism. It's about energy security. About making sure Canadian oil and gas has buyers beyond just one market. About making sure political fights in Washington don't derail entire sectors of the Canadian economy. And the results are starting to show. Investments are flowing in. Demand from Asia is solid. LNG shipments to Europe are ramping up. And new pipeline infrastructure is being developed with flexibility in mind, not just a straight line to the US, but a web of options that insulates Canada from external policy shocks. Meanwhile, the US is discovering the downside of assuming too much for too long. It's discovering that its refinery system is outdated, that it can't just flip a switch and replace Canadian crude with domestic production. That energy infrastructure, once ignored, now demands urgent attention and expensive upgrades. And that tariffs, once the favorite tool of economic coercion, don't scare a supplier who has alternative markets lined up and waiting. So what's next? The US has to decide whether it wants to adapt or double down. It can choose to modernize its refining systems, invest in energy flexibility, and treat Canada as a true partner. Or it can keep treating energy diplomacy like a one-way street at its own risk. Because the shift is already underway. Canada is moving on, not in anger, but with intent. Its LNG strategy is long-term. It's backed by private capital and public policy. It's oriented toward a future where energy doesn't flow through just one pipeline, to one customer, under one contract. It's a future of options, of resilience, of sovereignty. And Alberta's oil warning, that was a reminder, a marker in the sand, that the days of assumed loyalty, of passive supply chains, of overlooked dependence, they're over. This isn't about abandoning the US. It's about refusing to be boxed in by it. Because in a globalized energy market, the most powerful position isn't being the biggest producer. It's being the most adaptable. And right now, Canada is proving it's both. Because if the US isn't listening, it's going to wake up to a new energy order and realize it's no longer at the center of it. For decades, the relationship between the US and Canada on energy was treated like muscle memory. Oil flowed south, tariffs went north, and everything in between was managed by handshake diplomacy and pipeline negotiations. But that model is cracking. What Alberta just made clear is this. Canada is not interested in playing second fiddle anymore. It's not here to prop up US energy policy or absorb the fallout of DC dysfunction. Not when it has the tools, the market access, and the geopolitical timing to take control of its own path. And that path? It's leading away from dependency. Canada's LNG expansion is not a backup plan. It's the plan. It's what happens when a country realizes that hitching its economy to one that sees energy through the lens of politics instead of partnership is a liability. So now, LNG terminals are rising on the Pacific coast. Investment is pouring in. Long-term contracts are being signed across Asia and Europe. The global demand is there. The infrastructure is catching up. And Canada is setting itself up as a central player in a multipolar energy future. That future is no longer shaped solely by Washington. It's shaped by who has the gas, who can ship it quickly, and who's positioned for reliability in an age where energy volatility is no longer the exception, but the rule. And this is where Alberta's warning strikes hardest. It wasn't just a flex, it was a strategic shot across the bow of American energy complacency. 2 million barrels a day is not a small number. It's a chunk of the US refining system. It's a major piece of pricing stability in Midwest fuel markets. It's the difference between cushion and crisis. Let's talk about the U.S. energy system for a second. It's built on the assumption that Canadian heavy crude will always be available, that pipelines from Alberta will always keep the barrels flowing, that refineries designed decades ago for that exact feedstock can continue operating at full capacity without disruption. But here's the hard truth. Those assumptions are now liabilities. The U.S. can't just pivot to domestic light oil without major refinery modifications. It can't source the same quality of heavy crude from elsewhere without taking a hit on cost, reliability, or transport time. And it certainly can't match the shipping efficiency Canada is about to achieve with its new LNG terminals and Pacific access points. So the idea that the U.S. can just out-tariff or out-leverage its way back into energy dominance, that's over. Tariffs don't intimidate suppliers who've already diversified. Political pressure doesn't move a government that has more profitable buyers in Tokyo, Seoul, and Berlin than it does in Chicago. The playbook has changed, and the U.S. hasn't written the new one. Meanwhile, Canada is executing. It's investing in infrastructure with global value, not just regional utility. It's smoothing out the permitting process, giving investors clear timelines. It's responding to demand signals from markets that want cleaner burning LNG over coal. And it's building relationships with buyers who are looking for dependable suppliers that aren't weighed down by unpredictable domestic politics. That's what makes this moment so dramatic. Not because it's loud, but because it's quiet and deliberate. Canada didn't storm out of the room. It just built a new one. While Washington has been stuck in debate over Keystone XL, Alberta has been cutting deals to ship oil and gas across oceans. While the U.S. has swung between isolationist energy rhetoric and domestic production pride, Canada has been methodically laying the foundation to become a global energy hub. And here's the twist. For a long time, Canada wanted the U.S. to lead. It wanted cross-border infrastructure to be treated as mutual interest. It wanted investment certainty. It wanted a stable, bilateral energy relationship that acknowledged shared prosperity. But what it got was pipeline cancellations, policy instability, and economic volatility created by political theater. Canada is building leverage through LNG, through diversification, through infrastructure that turns energy exports into geopolitical power, not just economic gain. And it's doing it at a time when global demand for stable supply is skyrocketing. Energy is no longer just about production, it's about reliability. And Canada, for the first time, is stepping forward not just as a supplier, but as a strategic player on the world stage. If this breakdown helped connect the dots for you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who still thinks Canadian oil only flows one way. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Can the US regain its influence, or is Canada already gone? And hit subscribe for more unfiltered takes on the stories that are quietly reshaping global power dynamics. Because energy isn't just about fuel, it's about who's in control. And right now, Canada's got the momentum. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end, you're officially part of the small percentage of people who don't just click away, and that means a lot. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts, your ideas, or even what you'd like to see next. I read every single one of them, and your feedback genuinely shapes the direction of this channel. If you enjoyed the video, tap that like button. It tells YouTube this content is worth sharing. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload. We've got more exciting videos coming, and trust me, you'll want to be here for them. This channel is just getting started, and your support helps it grow faster than you realize. Thank you again for spending a part of your day here with me. Stay curious, stay motivated, and as always, take care of yourself. Until next time, I'll see you in the next video.